Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started. Tonight is going to be the first night that we're going to talk about content-y stuff. So tonight is going to be all about like economics, trade, finance, stuff like that. So this is all going to be very content-oriented and content-focused. So we're going to ditch a lot of the debate strategy stuff, and we'll have some fun doing it. Few quick things before we get started. First thing, as a quick overview, there's going to be 4 things that we cover tonight. Originally, I was going to cover 6 things, including ongoing trends within the economy, as well as case studies of recessions. Then I realized that I really like talking about economics, and there's no way I'd be able to fit all of that material in. So tonight, we're really just going to focus on 4 things: Econ 101, trade and development in general, the financial system and how it works, and then a bit on recessions, which I think is the underanalyzed gem of debating. Before we do that, though, a few quick announcements / caveats / warnings. First thing, this presentation might at some points be mildly less fun compared to other presentations. That being said, I think it's good content to know, so hopefully we will all have fun. Woohoo, econ, yeah, woo, 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 go finance. Second thing is that some of these slides are very dense. I've also tried to balance that out by having some very funny slides. So hopefully there's a nice enough mix that things make sense. The caveat I will add here is that I've tried to make this presentation as like approachable as possible. That's not to say it will actually end up being approachable. So if there are things that genuinely don't make sense / are confusing / I explain them as if I'm like a finance bro on Wall Street, please do stop me and be like, yo, that doesn't make sense, and we can chat about it. Other thing I sent out in the email, I'll send it out again probably tomorrow when I send out another email with the notes and stuff, is if you have questions about things we cover tonight that I don't answer or you don't ask, you can put it in a anonymous Google sheet thing. There's a few questions I haven't gotten around to answering there yet, but like you can ask stuff there because yeah, econ. Few quick warnings though before we get started. First, never use jargon in debate unless it's really, really well understood jargon, like interest rates. Never say like really, really complicated economics-y jargony terms. If you do, it's almost definitely going to backfire. Judges will look at you very confused. They'll assume you're speaking a foreign language and you'll probably drop with really bad speak. So TLDR, don't do it. Second thing I'd say in general is that as the economic arguments you're making become more complex, it's important to spend more time explaining them. It is really easy to convince the average judge that higher interest rates decreases inflation. It is much harder to run a neo-Fisherist argument that says that counterintuitively high interest rates actually encourage inflation, which is an argument you can make. So the more complex your arguments are, the more time you want to spend explaining them. This is a debate note, not an economics note, and the less jargony you want to be. Third thing, a lot of the stuff we're going to chat about tonight sounds difficult. I actually promise it's not. Wall Street, in my personal opinion, and finance people in general, try to make some things sound probably more complex than they actually objectively are. That doesn't actually mean these things are difficult or complicated. It just means that they sound difficult on face. But trust me, you can all get it. If I can get it, any of you can. Fourth, a lot of digital explainers about economics, like if you Google stocks or if you Google equity financing, are kind of annoying and stupidly complex. Always feel free to DM me. I'm happy to explain econ things. Fifth, whenever you make economic arguments in debate, I promise this is the penultimate thing about econ in debate before we get just get into pure econ. A lot of economic arguments, when you make them in debate, sound really stupid or sound like I don't give a flying fuck about that, so why should you? So spend time actually humanizing the impacts of econ arguments. Otherwise, judges will be very sad and they'll be like, well, why do I care? So paint a story about why we care about things like banks. Paint a story about why we care about things like inflation. Sixth thing is not everything I say in this presentation is going to be useful. I will repeat this. Most things I say in this presentation are never going to have topics set on them. The reason why we're still going to chat about them is twofold. One, I think that in general, being smart is a good thing for debate. Two, it helps to be able to run more interesting arguments. So a lot of the concepts, especially the harder ones we chat about tonight, you will never get emotion on, unless maybe you're debating at the college level, in which case, woohoo, good luck for you. You can beat me there. But in the vast bulk of instances, it does help to be able to potentially make economic arguments, even if the topic doesn't necessarily call for it. So if some of these things seem unnecessarily complex, or like, Ryan, why on earth do we need to know about like currency regimes? Yeah, you're never going to get emotion about them. It's still a good thing to know. Last thing, 3 quick disclaimers. First, never consider anything I say in this. I'm not sure why I'm saying this. I don't think any of you are going to sue me. And if you are going to sue me, I definitely like lose. But in case any of you want to sue me, now you can't sue me because I gave you like advice about investing that failed. Second thing, obviously do your own research. I'm not an expert on these things. Y'all are experts. Do your own reading. Third thing, I will not speak a word about NFTs. I'm sorry if anyone here is an NFT enthusiast. They are stupid as fuck, and I don't get them. And I get them. I just hate them. So like, we're not chatting about NFTs. They're awful. They're just like terrible. Like, they're just horrible. Like, they're just bad things to the world. Like, do not use them. Do not buy them. They're speculative assets that are probably just massive Ponzi scheme. Like, just, we're not going to chat about them. Last thing, in general, the best thing that you can do to get better at econ debates is just to practice them and just do a lot of casing with econ topics. So especially with topics that you're uncomfortable with, like take a motion that you just don't get and just learn it and write a case on it. Like, this house believes that central banks should pursue quantitative easing during economic crises. If you don't know what that topic means, like, force yourself to write a case on it. It's the best way to get better at this activity. Oopsies. Ryan, load. Lastly, we're going to be doing a bunch of things I'm going to be explaining a bunch of like complex econ terms in a kind of funny way, which is we're going to be using like this fake like little dude that I had to make on Google Slides. He shows up like 7 times in the presentation. So I figured that we should give him a name, or her, or them. What name should we give this person? Does anyone have ideas? This is not a serious thing, but I want ideas. Barry, Stewart, NFT Jeff, Bartholomew, Augustus, Bob, Steve. All right, I'm gonna go with All right, okay, let's go Carl, because Karl Marx. Ha 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 ha, really funny. So we'll go Carl. Everyone say hi, Carl. This guy's name from now on is Carl. Hang on, I will reflect the presentation to show that. Carl. Okay, everyone, this is Carl. I hope you like him. He's going to be our friend and companion on this, and he's going to be very helpful and useful. So woohoo, Carl. Okay, we're going to get started. Econ 101. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this for 2 reasons. First, there's a doc I'm going to send out to all of you guys, which is like 60 pages of me just taking notes on the fundamentals of economics. So there's a lot of extra resources available for you to help you understand this. Second thing, this is where there's the greatest surplus of non-debate resources. So it's very easy to Google things like aggregate demand or supply and demand curves and get reasonably helpful AP macro advice, for example, on these topics, which is why we're not going to spend as much time on them. The bread and butter of economics is supply and demand. Supply and demand literally can help you make, I'm going to say 96% of economic arguments you'll make in debate. Even really, really complicated stuff about advanced financial derivatives and whatever, it's just a game of supply and demand. TLDR of supply and demand. Demand is how much do people want to buy something? Supply is how much do companies want to produce something? In general, when you have more people wanting to buy something, prices tend to go up. So back at the beginning of the pandemic, when everyone was like, yo, we need hand sanitizer, bruh, everyone wanted to buy hand sanitizer and the price went like through the roof. And nowadays, in an era of supply chain disruptions, when companies are like really struggling to produce shit, prices are going up because when supply goes down, prices go up. So in general, the relationship between price and demand is proportionate, i.e. when demand goes up, so too does price. Inversely, on the area of supply, when companies produce more of something, prices tend to go down. So for example, when like, do you guys remember when like rainbow loom was a thing? Was I the only one who's really into that? You know, those like little bead things, those like little band things you would like loop and like put on your arms. Yeah, I remember those things. Yeah, fantastic stuff. Like those things, when they were like all the rage, those things were like everywhere. You could walk into like a gas station and buy those things. The supply was infinite. And then eventually it turns out that people just didn't want to buy them anymore, which is really sad. And then same thing with fidget spinners, I think. And then they stopped being bought. And so then there was a massive surplus of them. The other concept to be familiar with in terms of price is called elasticity. This basically refers to when prices change, how much does demand change? The most common arguments you'll make in regards to elasticity is whenever there is a product that people really, really, really have to buy, those are the areas where we care the most about making sure companies don't do really sketchy things. So for example, do you need to buy life-saving medicine? Duh, yeah. So if companies know that, they're often willing to try to charge you higher and higher prices. Whereas if the demand for a product is somewhat elastic, that would basically mean that if you, as a company, change the price significantly, the demand will also change significantly. So for example, if you change the price of like, I don't know, yogurt, up by 7,000%, people would stop buying yogurt, unless any of you are like yogurt enthusiasts and like desperately cannot live life without yogurt. But if you increase the price of, say, like a particular type of cancer medication or chemotherapy by 7,000, people still pay for it because they still need it. The way of visualizing this, though, broadly, is that supply and demand are kind of engaged in a constant tug of war. Customers want prices to be lower. Suppliers kind of wish that people are willing to spend more money. You eventually find some happy equilibrium. It's called a market clearing price. And that's kind of the point at which there is happy equilibrium. Everyone is happy. So woohoo, yay, yippee, hurrah. I'm going to skip some of these examples just for the sake of time, but you can obviously go back at the slides later and look through them. In terms of using supply and demand in debate, there are two things that you want to think about when it comes to applying the abstract idea of supply demand to actual debate arguments. The first thing is just thinking about how people respond, so how producers and how consumers respond to emotion, but also thinking about habits change as a consequence of emotion. So often people base consumption or even production habits, not just based on the actual price of things, but also what you think is going to happen in the future or what you think prices might look like in the future. So for example, if you can make arguments that say people will expect the price of X thing to go up in the future, they might, for example, be more inclined to buy that thing now as opposed to in the future when its price goes up. So A, think about how people will actually respond to price changes, and B, think about how people will perceive of price changes in the future. You can make a lot of good arguments based around that. Just to reiterate, 90% of debates you'll almost ever do are basically debates centered around supply and demand. If you can get really good at understanding supply and demand and how they work, you will win the vast majority of economic debates you do. Now, it's not that easy, so we have like another 190 slides to walk you through why it's not that easy. Couple of other like Econ 101 things to know about. Competition basically just means multiple companies compete against each other. So a crude analogy for this would be debate tournaments. If there are 20 teams at a debate tournament, like assuming that they are on average like randomly selected, which 20 teams they are, the best team doesn't have to be as good as the best team that wins a competition with 50 teams, because presumably the more people you're competing against, the better you have to be, because there's presumably someone else who might potentially be better than you. In the context of capitalism, what that basically means is that whenever there are multiple companies existing in a marketplace, there is a pressure for each individual company to outcompete the other by providing more options, lowering prices, and making better quality products. The flip side of commercial competition is monopolization. This is basically when you have one company, or more generally, a very small number of companies that are providing access to some sort of services. There are a bunch of ways that monopolies can arise, but the big two ones are basically coercive monopolization or natural monopolization. In some instances, monopolies come into power in very problematic, bad, actively deliberate ways. So for example, like if I wanted to try to monopolize the debate teaching universe, I would try to like acquire all the random ass like debate private coaching schools, or like beat out all of those other schools, or like assassinate their heads, which would be very immoral and illegal. And I'm not going to do it. Why do I say these things on tape? I don't know. Anyways, the point is, companies can try to expand market capture through what's called vertical and horizontal integration, which might mean, for example, merging with the companies that supply you goods. So if I'm Apple, for example, maybe I know that I need cobalt to put into my phones, so I acquire a cobalt mine because that makes me vertically integrated. Or you can engage in horizontal integration, which is, for example, this wouldn't happen, but like if Apple and Samsung were like, hey, we're best friends, want to merge? Oh yeah, and then they would merge. So monopolies can arise through deliberate measures, either coercive ones, like, forcibly acquiring other companies, or just naturally in some ways, like combining yourself with the competition. The other way that monopolies can arise is naturally. Not all monopolies are inherently bad. Sometimes it's actually really, really good to only have one company providing a service. So for example, just like based on like a quick gut check, how many people here in some capacity, you can just say like yes in chat or whatever, use some form of social media, like some form of social media? Okay, seems like a lot. Social media is a good example where the reason that people like being on like Snap Insta, or what's it called? Snapchat, right? Like the reason people like Snapchat is because everyone else is on Snapchat, or the reason you like Instagram is because everyone else is on Instagram. So in this context, the reason why a company like Instagram is so massive isn't necessarily because Instagram did a bunch of super sketchy things to become Instagram. It's just because naturally it makes more sense to have one like big ass social media company that everyone goes to as opposed to a bunch of really random small ones. So sometimes monopolies arise naturally through what are called network effects. Like it just makes more sense to have a bunch of people located on one particular platform. Sometimes monopolies arise because of what are called economies of scale. So for example, if you're building an electricity grid, it's really fucking expensive to build an electricity grid. And the only way that you can make a profit off of it is if you build a really giga large electricity grid and have a bunch of consumers paying you enough money to make it profitable. But it's almost never going to be profitable for you as an electricity company to only exist in one very small area because the startup costs are so enormous that you need to operate at a really large scale to make a profit. So TLDR, natural monopolies are monopolies that are monopolies, not necessarily because they're evil, but because it's just naturally more efficient for only one company to exist. That being said, even if a monopoly is a natural monopoly, there's still bad harms that come from monopolies. First, there's price fixing. If you're a company and there's no other company competing against you, and all that you want to do is make the cha-ching, cha-ching, your incentive is to raise prices, especially if the goods that you're selling are inelastic. But there's also a decreased incentive to provide a good quality of service. So a kind of weird but kind of interesting example of this is if you ever go to Walmart in somewhat rural areas where there's no other grocery store in town, if you compare the produce that those Walmarts sell to the produce sold at Walmarts in larger, more urban areas, the produce is like actual shit in the rural places. Not necessarily because it's impossible to like import like good fruits and vegetables or whatever, but because if you're Walmart, you know that there's no other grocery store or no other convenience store to turn to, so people have no option but to buy your really shitty apples, and therefore there's a decreased incentive to provide a good quality of service. The other reason why monopolies are bad is that they're horrible for workers. If, for example, there was only one tech company in the world that I as a software engineer could work at, that company can basically abuse the heck out of me because there's no viable alternative. There's a few ways that you can try to solve monopolies. You can try breaking them up, you can try regulating them, you can try nationalizing them. There's some examples, you can look through these later, but the most common way that we try to, think of fixing monopolies is just to break them up. This is called antitrust. I really think it would be funny to get this shirt. I get such a kick out of this. Isn't it funny? Okay, anyways. The gist, though, is antitrust is basically the laws that exist that allow us to break up monopolies. The goal of these laws is to promote competition, and the general idea is that monopolies reduce efficiency, and the way to promote efficiency is to promote competition. The dominant standard that antitrust regulators use when determining whether or not a company is a monopoly is called the Consumer Welfare Standard. This is basically a standard that says we will only break up companies if those companies are so big and so large they are actively harming consumers. And the general heuristic that's used by most regulators is there an immediate economic harm to consumers, like prices being raised? This is funky, and this motion hasn't yet been set at the high school level, but it's been set a lot at the college level. There's a lot of motions that can get set at the collegiate level about whether the consumer welfare standard is good nowadays, when a lot of the arguable monopolies that exist are not necessarily bad directly to consumers economically, but still are probably monopolies. Anyone want to think of an example other than Apple that I listed here as like an example of what this might look like? Of like a company that's really large and probably maybe possibly a monopoly or at least an oligopoly, but isn't necessarily doing objectively bad things. Yeah, Jeffrey.
Facebook?
Yes, classic example is Facebook. Absolutely like fucking gargantuan company, but doesn't charge consumers anything, at least on face. So arguably, the consumer welfare standard is bad in that context because when you have really large telecommunications or tech companies, maybe there isn't an independent harm to consumers economically. There's still harms that come as a consequence of that, etc. Okay, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I would definitely encourage you to look over these two slides later when I send the presentation out. Almost any motion that is like this house would break up X company is almost always just a debate about whether large companies are good or bad. If you are the team that supports breaking up companies, there's a couple of things that you can say for why companies are bad, but the very big picture, high level overview I'll give. First of all, large companies are anti-competitive. What that basically means is that it's harder for smaller companies to compete because they don't have as cheap resource inputs and because they're unable to cross-subsidize losses. So for example, if you're Amazon, Kindle is like a horrible product, like not in terms of quality, but from a financial perspective. The only reason it still exists is because Amazon, for the first many years of its existence, was able to cross-subsidize losses. So it makes a shit ton of money by selling, like, I don't know, whatever things Amazon sells to people these days. And it uses the profits from other parts of the Amazon business model to sustain Kindle, even when Kindle at first is losing to competitors. So large companies, TLDR, are often really bad for smaller firms that are trying to break into the market. There's also other reasons why large companies are bad for smaller firms. It's often the case that, for example, large companies can just sue smaller companies into the ground. They often have an enormous amount of like lobbying power. They have disproportionate social influence, all of which means that there is a lot of harm that occurs to smaller companies, which results in worse products, less innovation, etc. If you're the team that defends large companies, this is often where people tend to struggle more because it's easier to argue against large companies than for them. But there's a lot of reasons you can say why large companies are good. The most obvious and most important of which are just that large companies tend to provide cheaper products and better products insofar as they are already established in the market. They already have like suppliers. They already have established like supply chains, etc. And you can also make interesting arguments about why large companies tend to be more innovative. Probably the most interesting argument of which is just that in very many instances, large companies have the sufficient degree of risk tolerance necessary to pursue R&D. So if you're Google, for example, you're totally fine throwing like a ton of money into really speculative research programs, because even if it fails, no problem, you're Google, you're totally fine. Smaller companies don't have that advantage. You can also make arguments that larger companies tend to be more long-term oriented. If you're Amazon, you're not really worried about anyone beating you out tomorrow, but you are worried about a new upstart competitor maybe beating you out in 5 or 10 years, and that does give you a reasonably good incentive to pursue R&D. The other thing I'm just going to quickly mention, and again, you can read all this stuff later, there's a really cool argument, in my personal opinion, about why counterintuitively small firms are actually benefited by the existence of larger companies. And one of the more interesting ones is just that it's often the case that large companies will acquire small companies in their kind of infinite stage while they're still growing. And this sounds on face bad, but the interesting argument for why it's good is that there's often a lot of really great ideas that are launched in the form of small companies that, in the absence of some larger company to acquire that company and then take that idea and bring that idea to market, otherwise that idea might just never get sold to people. So for example, maybe I'm a brilliant scientist and I create a small company trying to sell something. It's very possible that I create a brilliant idea, but it just never goes big because I'm a horrible advertiser. If, say, Pfizer buys my company, realizes that my idea is really brilliant, they then get to bring that idea to market because they have the advertising team, they have the business experts, et cetera, to make that idea profitable. So kind of interesting argument on why counterintuitively large companies are good. Again, a lot more reasons here. These are some other examples you can read. Chaebols in South Korea are a really interesting example of oligopolistic companies, which is to say a very small number of very large, powerful firms that have an enormous amount of control and influence over economic and political outcomes within that country. So that's monopolies. That was a lot of information very quickly, and I skipped over most of it. Before we move on, questions on monopolies before we chat about other econ things? Gorgeous, cool. Okay. Oh wait, let's see. Did I get something? What's your monopoly? PO. Did I have monopoly? Oh, I don't know. Oh, I like the iron, and then they got rid of the iron. That was so sad. I also just got a question, which is like, how are monopolies good? It's hard to argue that monopolies are good, but you can make the arguments about why larger firms are good. It's probably hard to argue that independently monopolies are good. I'm sure you can try and just extend all the things from before. So next thing we're going to chat about is inflation. I'm going to assume people don't know who these two people are by face. This is John Maynard Keynes, Friedman, two people with very different opinions on inflation. Anyways, inflation, what is it? It basically means informally prices go up. Informally, it means that the purchasing power of your money goes down, which basically means that, for example, if I had $5 in the 1960s, I would be like absolutely balling out because I could buy like literally groceries for like 3 years probably. Versus $5 now gets me what, like a half a slice of pizza at most major debate tournaments. Inflation can happen in three broad ways. The first is basically what's called cost push. If you're a company, you want to maintain high profit margins. When the cost of producing goes up, that means that you need to raise prices to accommodate your original profit margin. So whenever the cost of producing something goes up, inflation occurs. Demand pull inflation happens in the inverse direction. When lots of people have more money, they start spending more on more stuff. And companies then raise prices to capitalize upon that increased demand because there's a relative shortage in the market, i.e., when there is a sudden increase in demand, there is less supply than there is demand that pushes prices up. The third and potentially final way that you could think of inflation as happening is basically the classic way that everyone thinks of inflation. Anyone want to say like what the average, well, I guess it's actually the opposite of what the average kid thinks, but like when most people think of inflation, like what do people think of in general? Like how it happens? Yeah, Jeffrey.
Money printer, go burr.
Yes, exactly. Like money printer, burr, burr, burr. This is ironically, this is one of the most disputed issues within like inflation circles. Not that there are inflation circles, but if there were, it's not entirely agreed upon economically whether printing money automatically equals inflation. So for example, there's this concept called modern monetary theory, MMT. You should look it up. It's fascinating. And modern monetary theorists actually embrace what every 7-year-old thinks the economy should do, which is just to print a fuck ton of money and spend it. So modern monetary theory has a really interesting view on economic stimulus, which is basically that if you're a government and you control your currency, there's no reason why you can't just print an endless amount of money, spend it however you want, and then counterintuitively use taxes to rein in inflation. So traditionally, governments raise money through taxes and then spend that money. Under an MMT approach to government stimulus, you would actually spend as much money as you want by printing it and then keep inflation in check by taxing it. So for example, if the IRS collects your tax dollars, the IRS would like just burn your money basically, like they wouldn't do anything with it just to keep inflation in check. But TLDR, the third way that inflation can happen is what's called, well, according to the quantity theory of money, the third way that inflation can happen is more money in the economy equates to higher prices. There's ways that you can dispute this. I've listed some of them here, but TLDR, it's generally a fine argument in debate to say we add money into the economy and that causes prices to go up. Interestingly, inflation is not inherently a bad thing. So in general, inflation can actually spur economic growth because if you know that your money is going to be less valuable in the future than it is now, you're more inclined to spend money now. That being said, out of control inflation, like maybe what we're seeing right now, can often be dangerous. It hurts the poor, it decreases your incentive to save, and it can often spiral out of control into things like hyperinflation, a la Zimbabwe or Venezuela, which are very sad and very bad. That hopefully answers your question, Varun. Not all inflation is bad. Fingers crossed. Hopefully that worked. Okay, quick little venture to Carl. So this is just going to be like a quick little thought experiment to talk to you guys about what inflation looks like and why it's inflationary and why, to get to Varun's question, inflation can often be quite bad. So here's Carl. Let's say Carl works at a factory that produces Samsung smart fridges. By the way, guys, if you ever hear me talking a lot about Samsung smart fridges, I don't have a weird thing for Samsung. I just think it's the memeiest thing that's ever been produced in the history of humankind, which is why I like to joke about it. So let's say there's a bunch of people in society who absolutely adore Samsung smart fridges. And one day they all of a sudden get a shit ton of money. Guess what happens? Before, they all wanted to buy Samsung smart fridges, but they ain't have the money. Now they have the money, so guess what happens? That's right, they spend a fuck ton of money buying a fuck ton of Samsung smart fridges, and that causes what's called demand, demand-based inflation, basically demand pull inflation, because now a bunch of people start spending money. There's too many dollars facing too many goods. Prices goes up. But then something funky happens, guys. Our boy Carl is working at this factory, but let's say Carl loves buying these Samsung smart fridges. He suddenly realized, yo, bruh, my fridges be costing a lot of money. He needs a raise. So he goes to his boss and says, hey, I need a raise, man. Guess what now happens? Now the man has to, oh, rip, it says my internet connection is unstable. That is so sad. If I blip out for y'all, let me know. Hang on, let me put it in chat so that y'all can see me. If I cut out, say, Ryan, you cut out. Hopefully you can hear me still. Okay, anyways. TLDR, implication of higher wages is a higher cost of production. Guess what happens as a consequence of that? The consequence of that is price goes up yet again. So originally we started with a $100 Samsung smart fridge. Now we're up to a $200 Samsung smart fridge. And that is sad. And the spiral continues onward and onward and onward. How tragic is that? I know. Okay, some quick advice on inflation arguments. Whenever you're making arguments about inflation, it's always important to frame inflation as being something that like actually matters. The fact that it affects people's purchasing power, the fact that it affects people's ability to access basic goods and services, humanizing inflation arguments is important. But you also want to make sure that whenever you're making inflationary arguments, you're doing the best possible job of it. So it's often quite useful to chat about the cyclical nature of inflation, like I just described. So it's one thing to say, oh, prices go up. That's a hard impact to weigh on. It's much easier to weigh on the impact of prices go up. This becomes cyclical. People expect inflation to continue, which causes prices to go up and up and up, and you lock yourself into a very damaging cycle. Whenever you're responding to inflation arguments, I think the easiest way to beat most inflation arguments you'll get in debate is basically just very, very simply to explain why inflation is not going to increase faster than wages increase, so that even if prices go up, people's money is going up by more, and to explain therefore that even to the extent inflation happens, it's comparatively less important. Yeah, Jeffrey? Was that a hand, I think?
Yeah, how does people expecting prices to go up like worsen inflation?
Yeah, so if I expect iPhones to cost more in the future and I need a new iPhone, I'm going to buy an iPhone now. But guess what that causes? If I'm expecting inflation to go up and I spend money now, then prices go up because of demand pull inflation. And therefore, my prophecy has been realized. So if I expect inflation to go up, then they actually go up. This also works in the inverse direction. If I'm a company and I'm afraid that prices are going to go up in the future, I actually can preemptively raise prices now to capitalize upon people's current fears of inflation. And then it becomes like a very damaging cycle, basically. George Washington is so sad because he was like, tea's too expensive. And now it's so expensive-er. Rip George Washington. So sad. Anyways, TLDR, humanize inflation arguments. Don't just say prices go up. Explain why that's bad. Other thing relating to inflation is unemployment. 3 types of unemployment. Really the only one that's most important, or okay, not most important. Important in the context of debate tends to be cyclical or structural. Frictional unemployment almost never comes up. It basically means like if I am leaving college and I used to work as a barista at Starbucks and I'm looking for a new job, I would be considered frictionally unemployed. The 2 more important types of unemployment are cyclical unemployment and structural unemployment. If I'm cyclically unemployed, that means the entire economy is in some sort of crisis. That means I've been laid off. Structural unemployment occurs when my skills are no longer needed, which necessarily drives some sort of, situation where I get laid off and there's a surplus of labor in the market, yada, yada, yada. Other thing that we all know about, but I'll quickly flag it. Artificial intelligence exists and it's taking all of our jobs. That's so sad. One of my least favorite arguments that gets made is like, oh, well, AI only affects the poor. AI affects the poor. It also affects people who aren't poor. Like the idea that it's like, oh, like inflation or sorry, unemployment, or like, oh my gosh, I can't speak. It's not the case that automation only affects like, people working in truck factories or whatever. It also affects lots of people. Think about doctors, lawyers, surgeons. Those people all get impacted by things like AI. So the impacts of AI are very much so broader. There's 2 very common debates you have about the response to large amounts of unemployment, especially as a consequence of AI, UBI and federal jobs guarantee. In general, you can make a lot of anti-arguments against these things through the lens of inflation, and you can make lots of arguments about why stimulus is generally good whenever you support them. Again, you can read more about that afterwards. Second part of this, stock econ arguments, things that come up a lot. There are 4 types of economic arguments that you can generally make in debate rounds. You can make arguments about growth. How do we best promote economic growth into the future? How do we best limit recession? How do we best limit inequality? And how do we best maximize the rights of workers? In general, I think that it's chronically underutilized to talk about recessions. They're fantastically easy to weigh on. No one knows how to respond to them. And they're really, really great if you can argue them well. But just that's my personal opinion. Take it with a grain of salt. A few common clashes that you can chat about. I'm not going to cover these because of time, but a lot of the common clashes that you'll see in econ debates are clashes over higher versus lower wages. There's often clashes like we chatted about last week between, do you want to maximize economic growth or maximize environmental outcomes? Do you want to protect against recessions or do you want to maximize growth? They're all kind of common-ish sort of clashes that tend to come up in like, lots of debates or whatever. Thank you for quoting me on that, Julia. Really nice of you. Quick side note for American parleyers. These are some ideas for how you can fund stuff. Like the United States federal government should do this thing. How do you fund it? There's some things that you can do. You could do a value added tax, carbon tax. You could raise the capital gains tax. I always love doing that because it's fun and everyone's like, bro, what? You could do a wealth tax, which is like just tax really rich people. You could slash the military budget. By we, I mean the United States spends $80 million per year on Viagra for soldiers. So like that seems sketchy. You can also do non-orthodox things, but whenever you do these, judges will probably get confused and be like, sir, what are you on and why is Norway making an appearance in this debate? So probably don't do those things. Last thing we're going to chat about within the realm of Econ 101 before we get involved in more exciting stuff. Quick note on nationalization versus privatization debates. These debates tend to be pretty stock in the sense that you could have this house would nationalize or this house would privatize almost any type of industry motion, and a lot of the similar arguments would be made. I'm going to send you all notes on generic advice for arguing for nationalized or privatized companies. The TLDR is that you're almost always making arguments about why regulation either works or doesn't work, why profit incentives are better or worse compared to democratic incentives, and why governments have better or worse capacity to manage industries well, and stuff like that. All right, enough of the boring macro stuff. We'll quickly chat about labor markets. All of the supply and demand stuff from before we chatted about was exclusively discussed in the context of product markets, but it also works in the context of labor markets. Labor market is basically just the concept of like people needing to get jobs and companies needing to employ people. So all of the same rules from before about supply and demand apply here as well. The difference is just a question of perspective. So when we talk about the labor market, the supply of labor is basically like how many people are like offering to work. And the demand for labor is like how many workers do companies need. And in most instances in debate, there tends to be a focus on the supply side of labor. So for example, sweatshops are instances in which there tends to be a very large supply of labor. And that's why companies can at least try to get away with treating workers horribly, because if you don't accept these terrible conditions or this terrible wage, there's someone else that probably will. You can, of course, also make arguments about the trend, or sorry, the arguments about the demand for labor. The kind of common instance of this is that the trend is that automation decreases the demand for human workers. But obviously, you can make arguments about either the supply or demand side of the labor market and the subsequent impact that has on things like wages, things like benefits, things like the quality of experience for workers, et cetera. A few examples, you can look at those later. The most common debate that you'll have in regards to labor, though, is not a supply-demand argument. It's arguments about or motions about unions. Unions basically capitalize upon the principle of collective bargaining or power in numbers. So the idea is basically, if I'm an individual worker working for some sort of company, I have next to zero influence over that company, in the sense that if I go to my boss and say, yo, boss man, dude, I need a raise, my boss can be like, ha ha, sucks for you. We don't really need you, but you really need us, because if we fire you, whatever, we have 9,999 other employees out there. We're going to be fine. If we fire you, you are homeless, you've lost your job, you're in a really rough position. The idea of collective bargaining is if a bunch of workers come together and bargain for better wages or conditions collectively, that's the situation where workers gain enough power over corporations to limit the profit incentive of corporations and actually get things like better outcomes. And the primary mechanism through which this happens is unions, which basically threaten to strike, which basically is when a bunch of workers stop working all at the same time. This is horrible for companies because they basically stop producing stuff and their image is often tanked. And so what basically that means is that unions can threaten to stop working, and they use that threat in exchange to get benefits in the sort of contract negotiation period with companies. So they got things like better wages, better conditions, and stuff like that. That being said, unions are not perfectly effective. There's a lot of reasons why they're not always great. It's often the case that unions are plagued by issues of corruption. They're often represented by a very narrow group of elites. And there's often multiple unions which exist within any particular industry or within any particular company. And obviously, if unions gain power in numbers, When your numbers are fragmented, your power is also fragmented. The other issue with unions is that in general, membership, especially in the West, with the exception of Scandinavia, is generally on the decline. So for example, in the United States, fewer than 10% of private sector employees are unionized. Public sector workers tend to be on average more unionized. And despite the fact that unionized workers do earn higher wages on average, there's still a general decreasing participation rate within unions. One of the kind of common-ish reasons that's like identified in part for why unions have been on the decline, especially in the United States, is basically in the 80s when Reagan was president, he broke up a union strike that was being done by the air traffic controller union, and like very forcibly broke it up. And that is like often considered one of the main instances where union power in the United States began to decline. So TLDR, oh, the irony here is that the union that he broke up had supported him in the 1980 campaign for presidency. So like, ha, 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 oopsies, hashtag oopsies. Yeah, so that was a fuck you Reagan moment. Okay. Wow, guys, impressive. Y'all did Econ 101. Questions on Econ 101 stuff before we move on and start chatting about, I think trade is up next. Any questions on that, folks? Yeah, Caden.
Yeah, can you explain briefly just how antitrust works? Like, how does the US, how would a government actually go out and break up a monopoly?
Yeah, so antitrust legislation, like the Sherman Antitrust Act in the United States, gives government regulators the power to break companies up. What that basically means is you would basically look at a company and you would find natural cleavages within the company to basically split that one company up into many different companies. So for example, if you ever have a motion that is like, we should break up Facebook or break up Meta, the most likely way that we would break up Facebook if we deemed Facebook to be a monopoly is that we would cut like the actual Facebook off from Instagram, off from all of these other things, yada, 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 blah, blah, blah. So TLDR is like the way the antitrust legislation plays out is that regulators basically take a company that they deem as being a monopoly and then basically break it up to be a bunch of smaller companies, if that makes sense. I also got a quick question in chat. What are recessions? I'll chat about this later in the recession section. Recessions are when the economy is suffering. So when people are losing their jobs in really large numbers and the economy is suffering, that's basically what a recession is. Varun?
Like how does like natural inflation work? Because like or is all inflation caused by some certain like factor?
Yeah, so inflation is not inherently a bad thing and it's very natural. So like organically, the fact that people are always spending money means that prices do tend to just go up organically. That being said, the thing that you want to be wary of, like not in debate, but in general, is when there are shocks to the economy that very abruptly affect price levels. So the most two common examples of this would either be demand side shocks. So for example, when lots of people get laid off, almost immediately people have less money to spend on stuff. That means demand goes down, prices go down, and you get a really bad case of deflation, which is when prices go down, which is also quite bad. The other kind of trigger scenario is when there is a supply shock. So a really common example of this is oil crisis. Whenever there is a sudden decrease in oil production, or when there's an oil boycott, for instance, or embargo rather, if you can't access oil, you can't supply stuff. And if you can't supply stuff, then guess what happens? Prices go through the roof. So inflation itself is a naturally occurring thing, and central banks try to get inflation to happen. The risk is inflation happens because of exogenous shocks. That can often be quite damaging because it becomes cyclical. Adrian? Wait, can you speak like closer to your mic or something? Unless it's just my mic being very funky. Wait, is it just me or is that like just a me thing that I...
No, it's not just you.
Do you want to try typing in the chat, Adrian? I don't know if it's like your mic seems to be like a little bit funky. I don't know. Zoom is funky. Funky rhymes with a lot of words, but none of them make sense. Like chunky, funky monkey doesn't sound like a good type of ice cream. Or maybe it does, but I don't know what like monkey ice cream would mean. That'd be kind of funky.
What's your favorite type of ice cream, Ryan?
That's a good question. I don't know. Like, oh, can you explain value-added tax? Yeah, let me find the slide right so I can put it up so people know what I'm talking about. TLDR, a value-added tax, it's a really funky tax. Andrew Yang proposed it in his 2020 presidential run. It's basically a thing where at every stage of production, you basically tax the company that's involved in producing. So instead of taxing individual consumers, you basically instead tax the supply chain. It's more complicated than that, but TLDR, the main gist of what a value-added tax does is it raises a lot of money by basically taxing the companies involved in the production of intermediate goods, reflecting like the various tax burdens of those companies before it ends up reaching the like end consumer. I'd recommend
Doesn't that
like
ultimately raise prices though?
yeah, it does. But the idea is that it's not directly like it's not levied directly / immediately on those institutions. I'll do like a short like little write up on it and I'll put it in the notes so that you can read more on it there. Okay. Trade. Here we go. Fun stuffs. And all of that. So trade, what does it mean? It basically means when multiple countries reduce the barriers to their companies and people trading. To be clear, when we talk about trade, we're not talking about like I give Julia an apple and I get a banana in return or whatever. When we talk about trade, we're talking about countries selling different goods to each other, not like I sell you oil and you sell me iPhones, but like I sell you oil, you give me money, and then I give you iPhones and you give me money. That's basically what trade means. In the absence of free trade, companies often pursue protectionist policies. These are basically measures that are designed to protect your own companies and try to stop foreign companies from making money. So the most common instance of this is what's called a tariff. Tariffs are basically when I, as a country, say anything produced outside of my country, I will make artificially more expensive by basically levying an additional tax on that product. The rationale behind this is if I'm the United States and I, for example, want to protect my steel companies, if China tries to sell steel into the United States, I slap a tariff on Chinese steel. That makes Chinese produced steel much more expensive. So as an American company involved in, let's say, construction, I'm now more likely to buy from an American producing steel company as opposed to a China-based steel producing company because it's simply more cost efficient to do so. But tariffs, of course, inevitably end up raising prices because in the absence of tariffs, producers would have simply bought from a different intermediary supplier, most likely from another country. There's also non-tariff barriers to trade, but they're a bit less important. There are kind of three very common arguments that you'll hear in support of trade and in support of free trade in general. The first is specialization or the principle of comparative advantage. The idea basically is if countries don't trade with each other and they just try to be self-sufficient and self-sustaining, the problem they often encounter is that countries are just naturally more or less efficient at producing some types of things. So for example, maybe one country is really good at producing pencils and one country is really good at producing butter, but they're not both good at producing both. It would make more sense for one of them to produce exclusively pencils and one of them to produce exclusively trade and then trade pencils for butter, since that's naturally more efficient and results in better prices for both of them. So TLDR, trade allows countries to specialize in a way that increases efficiency. The second major argument that you'll hear in support of free trade is basically just cheaper products. And the idea is pretty intuitive, just that in instances in which one country can produce something better than another country, when you allow those countries to trade, naturally, consumers will be able to access the cheaper products. And barriers to trade inevitably raise prices because things like tariffs, for instance, make things more expensive. And that ends up raising costs both for producers as well as for consumers. The other non-economic argument you'll often hear in support of trade is basically that when countries start to trade with each other, they're also more likely to develop mutually advantageous political, economic, social, even military ties. So a kind of weird analogy to this would be a group project, like a really important one at school. If you are working with one other person on a group project, for instance, in like even if you really hate that person, you need to work with them because if you don't, you're both going to get like C's, and that's very sad. So at some point in time, you just need to cooperate with that person, even if maybe at first you're reluctant to. So the non-stupid analogy reason why this matters is that when countries trade, they develop a large degree of mutual economic codependence. And that means that on the margins, you're less likely to have things like conflict between those two countries. The kind of really stupid example you'll hear people say, but it sounds kind of cool, is I don't know if this is still true, but as of like at least 2 years ago, it was no two countries with the McDonald's have ever directly gone to war with each other. It's not entirely true perfectly, but the general idea behind it is decently true, that when you allow for trade, you're less likely to have political or military skirmishes between different countries. That being said, trade is not all rainbows and unicorns. There's some arguments against free trade. The best argument against free trade is basically just that in lots of instances, when you have free trade, you fuck over poorer or less developed countries because industries and companies within those states just haven't yet had the time or ability to grow to the point where they can actually compete on a global stage. So if I'm a local peanut butter producing company, I can't compete with Jif, I can't compete with Skippy. But if I'm put in a market where I'm competing against them and I'm putting my product on shelves next to theirs, I will always lose out because I'm producing a worse product at a higher price. The argument against free trade is that you need a period of time for these nascent or emerging industries to grow within these developing economies before you open those economies up to trade. Otherwise, they get killed off, you lose jobs, people become unemployed, which is also bad politically, a la the rise of Trump in the United States. Corporate capture is basically when very powerful Western companies come into relatively poorer countries to do things like establish factories, to do things like build infrastructure. The problem often is that those companies are incredibly powerful. They're able to do things like lobby governments to reduce wages. They're often able to do things like exert massive amounts of political influence over governments in a way which is often quite bad. And race to the bottom is kind of an interesting argument against trade. The idea is, if I am Vietnam and I'm part of a trade deal, right now I get a bunch of money because, or a bunch of economic benefits, let's say, because Nike has factories based in my country. The problem is that under a paradigm of free trade, Nike could be producing in any number of countries. So if I'm Nike, I go to Vietnam and I say things like, if you do not lower your minimum wage, we are going to leave your country because there's 15 other countries that would more than happily support a Nike factory with terrible minimum wages. And that means that if I'm Nike, I have to lower my minimum wage because the threat of Nike leaving, or even just the willingness to attract another company to move into my borders, is really, really economically significant for me. So the argument against trade is basically just that trade exacerbates the race to the bottom effect, the point at which multiple different countries are competing against each other to kind of attract foreign investment and stuff like that, which often results in worse outcomes for workers and often displaces or crowds out domestic industries that are often quite significant. These are some major free trade areas. We'll chat more about them when we chat about international politics. Don't worry about them for the current moment. Okay, side note from trade. A lot of debates about the developing world are implicitly debates about economic development, which is basically just to say, how do we take poor agrarian, in other words, mostly based around agricultural countries, and transition them into wealthier or more industrialized countries? The question that basically this then begets is, how do you develop an economy? There are two very dominant trains of thought on the question of what is the best way to take a poor country and turn them into a not poor country. They're called export-oriented industrialization and import substitution industrialization. Empirically, most like academic/economic literature tends to favor export-oriented industrialization, but there's arguments you can make for either of them. If you try to develop economies through exports, what that basically means is, as a country, you pursue a bunch of policies that try to really force companies within your own country to get really, really good at selling outside of your own country. In other words, your goal is to develop an export-oriented economy. And just to be clear, in case this is confusing, exports is when you produce something and sell it elsewhere. Imports is when someone else outside of your country produces something and you bring it into your country. So if you're trying to make your economy export-oriented, that's just fancy talk for you're trying to make your economy so powerful that your companies are so good that they're able to sell their goods not just in your own country, but also around the world. The Asian tigers, which are South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, are the most commonly cited example of where this went fantastically up until 1997. So the Asian tigers were 4 countries within kind of Southeast Asia and Asia in general that had like ridiculously high GDP growth rates for like multiple decades, frankly, really up until 1997 when there was a big Asian financial crisis. F in chat. Import substitution industrialization is a different way of thinking about developing a poor country. This basically aims to do something a little bit different, which basically is export-oriented industrialization tries to make your economy really good at selling elsewhere. Substitution-based industrialization basically tries to make your economy kind of immune to foreign companies selling into your markets. So for example, if I was Vietnam, instead of trying to make shoe manufacturers based in Vietnam really good at selling shoes to the United States, I might instead try to make my shoe companies good enough or protected enough they can sell shoes to people within Vietnam. So import substitution industrialization is basically where you try to make your domestic industry strong enough to sell within your own country and therefore substitute your own produced goods for imports. So instead of buying a bunch of stuff from abroad, you want to make your own economy industrialized enough that you can sustain yourself. The kind of classic example of this is Latin America after World War II. Maybe hashtag wasn't amazing in all instances, but Mexico is the best example of where this worked. They had basically 2 straight decades where they never had GDP growth rates dip below 6% year per year. So they did pretty well. And then the 1980s happened and Latin America had some troubles. They had a big debt crisis, which was very sad. But no matter whether you're an EOI type gal or an ISI type sir, no matter what type of person you are, what's generally agreed upon, I shouldn't say that, but what is generally can be argued to be good in debate rounds is that foreign direct investment is a really good way of developing economies. That basically means it's really great when you can get foreign companies to set up infrastructure in your country. Things like factories, things like technology, because that creates jobs and that kind of boosts domestic purchasing power. And so if you can try to find ways to explain, oh, here's why foreign companies are going to enter into these countries more. Here's why foreign investors are going to view your country in a more favorable way. That's often a pretty good path to sort of proving you get better forms of economic development. So that was like 15 minutes of complex economic analysis on trade. Before I move on to chat about the worst part of this presentation, that's going to make all of you really, really angry at me. Questions on that? Are we all like trade experts? Impressive. Good job, folks. Y'all are an impressive crew. An impressive gang. Okay. Next thing we're going to chat about is finance. I just want to quickly emphasize, importantly, before we get started, that not all of this is important for debate. Some of this is just me nerding out. And in case this is confusing, it is not vital that you know all of this. Now that warning's been out of the way, let's get going. Yeah, so TLDR, finance debates get very ugly very quickly. So, and just to be clear, you'll never have finance debates in high school. I don't think I've ever seen a motion in high school that was explicitly a finance debate. You'll get them in university, but it's rare. But you can obviously still make finance-y arguments every now and then. Okay, 6 things we're going to chat about. I really lied. It's only going to be 4. 2 of them I'm going to cover in separate documents. I'll send out to you tomorrow. We're basically going to talk about financial assets, monetary policy, regulations on the financial sector, and then currency regime / currency in general. So first on the financial sector, there's like so many different parts of the financial system, but there's a few big things we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on banks. We're going to focus on central banks. We're going to focus on government regulation, and we're going to focus a wee little bit on stock markets, although that's not as important. And we're also going to focus a decent bit on lending and how lending markets work in general. First on banks, there's 2 very large types of banks. There are commercial banks and there are investment banks. You'll also sometimes hear commercial banks referred to as retail banks. How do commercial banks work? The way that commercial banks work is that they work in the way that most people think they work, which basically is you have someone who comes along and says, this is Carl. Everyone say, hi, Carl. There's Carl. Carl has some money. Carl wants to deposit his money at a bank. And so Carl says, hey, yo, bank, I'll give you my money if you in exchange agree to pay me some interest every single year. In other words, I'll give you my money, but when I take my money out, I want more money than I put in initially. And you might ask yourself, well, why on earth did the bank accept that? Why would the bank agree to pay Carl money? Well, it's because once the bank has Carl's money, then the bank is able to lend that money out as it so desires. And so basically what you might do if you're the bank here is you have some person, let's say a company, who comes along and says, hey, yo, I need a loan. The bank says, we got you, fam. I'll give you the money because Carl just gave me like $100. But what you as the bank do is you look at this business dude and you say, hey, you're going to have to pay me back with interest. So what ends up happening at the end of this is if everything goes successfully, and again, there's a bit of an asterisk on that, if everything goes successfully, the bank takes Carl's money, lends Carl's money out, gets paid back Carl's money with extra interest, and then Carl comes back and takes a little bit less of that money out. The bank has made a profit, the investor dude got his money, and Carl gets his money back paid with interest. Now, there's a few things to understand about commercial banking. The most important of which is that commercial banking is the type of bank that functions within the sort of like realm of lending. And what I mean by that is basically that commercial banks, like I just sort of illustrated there, accept deposits. They use those deposits to basically lend out. And then subsequently, those loans get paid back with some form of interest. Oops, wait, what on earth? Oh, haha, get it? Haha, there's so much debt because like, you're borrowing. Haha. Okay, anyways, that being said, it's a little bit trickier than what I just described it as. And there's two things that make commercial banking a little bit trickier. The first is that banks operate on what's called a fractional reserve system. So what you might have noticed is that there's something really odd about this example, this analogy we walked through. Does anyone like want to give a crack at like what makes this weird, this whole banking thing? There's a time problem. And there's like specifically, there's something funky that happens here. What has happened when the bank gave this $100 to this business? Like, what's funky about the situation? After the bank has lent out $100, how much money does the bank actually have, like in cash in its vaults? If someone wants to guess. Anyone want to take a guess? Oops, hang on, Ryan.
0?
Yeah, 0, exactly. So the issue, oh, sorry, if I probably missed some of the other things that you guys sent, oopsies. Yeah, so the issue right now is that once the bank lends out this $100, the bank is $0. Carl has $100 theoretically deposited at the bank, and that's a problem, right? So this is basically what I mean when I say banks operate on a fractional reserve system. The government basically requires that banks keep a certain ratio of their deposits in reserve, which basically means if Carl gives the bank $100, the bank can't actually keep all $100. It has to keep some fraction of those $100 in reserve. And the idea is when you have many hundreds or thousands or even millions of depositors, the idea is that not all depositors would ever come to the bank and ask for their money out at the same time. And so the idea is if I keep 20% of Carl's money and 20% of Varun's money and 20% of Julia's money and 20% of Ryan's, like if I keep a little bit of everyone's money in reserve, if just one of those people comes into the bank and says, hey, I want my money out, no problem, no foul, no issue. Because this fractional reserve system generally tends to be fine insofar as you keep a percentage of deposits in reserve and you lend the rest out. Now, once you've lent the rest out, the money multiplier effect kicks in. This is the second thing that's funky about banks. The money multiplier effect basically is just the idea that when money enters the economy, it grows multiplicatively. So for example, we'll play like a little fun game because why not? Who doesn't like fun games? Everyone likes fun games. Fun. Okay, who should I pick on? I'll pick on you, Emily. So Emily, if I gave you $100, what would you spend the $100 on?
Really terrible coffee.
Okay, cool. Terrible coffee. Okay, let's see. Who do I want to pick on? Julia, it's your lucky day. You're working as a coffee barista. And then Emily just came in and spent $100 on your business. Let's say the business keeps $60 of that. So Julia, you have $40. What are you spending $40 on?
A puppy.
Okay, Julia buys a puppy. Good news is that who do I want to pick on? Good news is that Isha's working at the puppy shelter. So Isha, you get, let's say $30. What are you spending $30 on?
Churros.
Good answer. Churros. Okay, so $30 are spent on churros. Varun, you're working at the churro shop. You get paid $10. What are you spending the $10 on? Varun is thoroughly indecisive. Excellent. Really metaphorical. Good job.
Very decisive. Don't put these decisions on me.
You what?
Don't put these decisions on me.
Oh, okay, fair. Well, anyways, the gist basically is no matter what Varun would spend his $10 on, this is the idea of money multiplying, right? We started with $100, but that $100 ended up doing a lot more than just $100 worth of work, right? $100, then we get $60 spent, then we get $40 spent, then we get $30 spent, then we get another $10 spent. So the idea is that the more money that's lent out into the economy, the more that money grows and grows and grows. That being said, there's a hitch in the whole system. And this is why prior to 1933, the banking system was like, you're like classic like teenage high schooler, which is to say constantly in crisis and for good reason, which basically is just that. If you're a bank you never have as much in reserve as people have deposited into your bank. So earlier on, I said a sentence, which was a really stupid sentence, but it was deliberately stupid. I said a sentence which is, if a bank has 20% of my deposit and Julia's deposit and Varun's deposit and Emily's deposit and Isha's deposit, it's totally fine because presumably not all of us will all come into the bank demanding that we get our money out at the same exact time. But the problem is that sometimes we all will come into the bank demanding our money at the same exact time. And here's the problem. Maybe the bank is 20% of my deposit, 20% of Isha's deposit and Varun's deposit and Julia's deposit. But in total, that's 80% of just like one of our deposits. If all four of us come rushing into the bank demanding our money gets pulled out, the bank literally doesn't have the money to pay all of us back out. This is what's called a bank run. In periods of economic fear, people get really scared the bank is going to go under because they know the bank doesn't have everyone's money. So everyone wants to be the first person standing in line at the bank because they want to be the first person who gets to pull their money out, because they know that everyone else behind them is going to get screwed over because the bank literally doesn't have the money necessary to pay them out. So this is basically what a bank run is. It's when the period, it's like when in a period of economic crisis, everyone rushes to a bank, tries to pull their money out because they are afraid that banks go under. Now, this is not just true for recessions. It's true for any time that people are scared that a bank is going to collapse, even if the bank is actually going to be totally fine. So especially in the context of like kind of contemporary financial sectors, you can often make arguments about the potentiality of bank runs if people are afraid that banks collapse. That being said, post-1933, the government's been pretty good about knowing this is a problem, which is why the government set up what's called FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which basically insures deposits up to 250 grand. So in other words, if you deposit $250,000 into a bank, no matter what the fuck happens to the bank, your money is fine. The government protects your money. If you have $251,000, that extra dollar, if the bank goes under, sorry, bud, you lose your money. When I was like learning about this 2 years ago, I had a really funny Google search, which is like, does Bill Gates have like 7 bazillion bank accounts with like $250,000 in all of them? And then I realized hedge funds exist. Anyways, this is kind of like a visual representation. Like they're like are literally bank runs. Like people will like literally run to banks. So for example, at the very beginning of the Ukraine invasion back in like February, early March, you could like look at pictures of a bunch of Russians lining up outside of ATMs because they were afraid banks were going to go under because of sanctions. Yeah, Varun, is this what you're going to spend your money on?
Do bank runs ultimately cause banks to go under in the first place?
Yeah. So the regulatory safeguards limit that problem, but yes, like if bank runs happen, they actually do destroy banks in the absence of sufficient regulation, because everyone actually does just pull their money out and you as a bank get totally screwed over. You have no money to lend out. You're not able to get loans because no one trusts you, etc. So TLDR, first type of banks are called commercial or retail banks. Retail banks generally tend to serve regular people and regular businesses. Investment banks are where the real shit happens, not good shit, bad shit. What are investment banks? Investment banks operate very differently. Investment banks don't actually accept money, they manage money, which basically means that instead of taking someone's deposit and lending it out, they take a rich dude's money or a rich corporation's money and invest it on their behalf or provide tailored financial services like asset management advice. They advise corporations on how to restructure and how to merge and acquire other companies, yada, yada, yada. So commercial banks make their money through interest. Investment banks make their money through things like fees and commissions paid by clients. Now, investment banks become funky because they tend to be riskier on average than commercial banks. And there's a lot of speculatory reasons for why that's the case, but probably one of the biggest ones is just that most investment banks tend to just have to engage in more risky behaviors to make profit. There's often a culture within a lot of investment banks of like kind of arrogance to some extent. Like there's kind of an internal culture in lots of mainstream investment banks, think Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, of like individual banking analysts thinking that they're fantastic at their job, etc. But most importantly, it's because lots of these banks are just comparatively far less regulated than deposit accepting banks. If I'm a commercial bank, I have like so many regulations on top of me, it's crazy. If I'm an investment bank, I'm not as regulated because I don't accept deposits. So at that point in time, like I basically might as well just be a kid sitting in a garage being like, hey, give me $5, I'll invest it for you, as opposed to formally taking a deposit and then managing that, at which point I'm subject to lots of regulations. This leads really nicely then into how financial markets work and how they interact with investment banks, which is where a lot of our discussion is going to be centered. So and by the way, this is where stuff starts to get a little bit funkier. I apologize in advance. Financial markets are basically just places where buyers meet sellers. You can kind of think of this like a farmer's market. That's what I'm thinking of. Where like, the farmers come with their like fresh strawberries and they're like, do you want the fresh strawberries? And then everyone's like, yes. And they're like, this is $18. And you're like, holy fuck, I don't want $18 strawberries. So financial markets are basically where buyers want to meet sellers. In the modern era, a lot of these markets are fully digital. So for example, like especially post-COVID, if you want to buy a stock, these things all happen through like really sophisticated computer machinery type stuff. But the gist is like financial markets basically just have the technology that allows someone who has an asset, in other words, a thingy-diddly-bobbery-doo that can make money, to sell that thingy-diddly-bobbery-doo to someone else who's buying it or who's selling it. There's a lot of things I've listed here. This is not important. This is just for your information, FYI. Financial markets work because there's lots of middlemen, people like stockbrokers, who will connect buyers to sellers. So for example, if I want to buy a share of Apple, I don't call up Tim Cook and be like, yo, Tim Apple, man, I want to buy your stock. What you actually do is you go to a stockbroker who connects you to some sort of financial intermediary, which can sell you an Apple stock. The things I've listed here are some of the major institutional investors that exist within the economy. These are the investors that own a disproportionate amount of financial assets like stocks and bonds. The most common types of funds you'll hear about are pension, mutual, or hedge funds. Venture capital and private equity are a lot funkier. Oh my gosh, are we like losing a bunch of people now as we start getting into... Anyways, I thought that this would be kind of the funkier section, so we're gonna have fun with it. Venture capital and private equity are different than most other types of financial investment firms and hubs. They tend to focus their capital on smaller scale, non-publicly listed companies. I'll explain what that means in just a second, FYI. And basically what they tend to do is invest into like higher potential yielding companies that might be a little bit riskier. Again, more information here to read about later if you want to look at it. The question you're probably asking yourself though is, okay, Ryan, so there's a bunch of investors who go to financial markets because they want to buy stuff, but what exactly are they buying? Great question, me. I'm so glad you asked. Securities. Securities is a really obnoxious term for basically just a thing that you can buy on a financial market. I don't know, like it's stupid. Why the fuck do they call them securities? Because they want to confuse average Americans and Canadians. That's why. The two most common types of securities that you'll talk about in debate are stocks and bonds. I wrote up a longer explanation for how stocks work on the Google sheet memory do thingy. You can check it out there. But the long story short of stocks is basically this. Stocks are when you buy an ownership stake in a company, which basically just means you give money to a company, and in exchange, you are entitled to a share of that company's profits, and you're entitled to partial ownership over corporate decisions. Now, to be clear, guys, like in reality, this doesn't mean that like if you own one share of Walmart, like the corporate board of Walmart calls you up every time they're like hiring and firing a worker, and they're like, hey, buddy, what do you think about this dude for our local regional manager position? Like they don't do that. The idea though is that when it comes to big picture decisions about who's sitting on your corporate board, what is the vision of your company, owning a lot of stocks, in other words, shares in a company, entitles you to partial control over how the company works. Now, shares themselves are just like pieces of paper that represent ownership in a company. And the price of that piece of paper is determined through, guess what? You guessed it, supply and demand. Basically, the gist is that when a company goes public or launches what's called an IPO, an initial public offering, it basically says, we are now going to become a publicly traded company. They issue shares to the public. And that means that there is a supply of shares that are available for purchase. What basically subsequently happens is that investors can buy or sell their shares of stock. If you think that a company is going to become really valuable in the future, you're going to buy a share of stock in that company. Why? Because you think that that company's profits are going to go up in the future. So the value of their stock is going to go up in the future. So you can buy the stock low now and sell it high later. Conversely, if you think the company is going to fail and you're currently owning a share of ownership in that company, you're probably going to sell off your share of stock. I'm not going to talk about share buybacks, although I have a lot of opinions on them. So I guess after this, we can talk about share buybacks, like after all of you have gone to bed, I guess. So long story short, stocks are when you basically buy ownership stake in a company. You are entitled to a share of that company's profits. You can sell that stock off for money. You also have control over corporate decisions. Before we chat about bonds, So is everyone just buying money or the promise of money with money? Yes, basically. The whole financial system is a scam. It's basically just people making bets with other people because they want to like compare their financial dicks. Yes, basically. I think Jeffrey had a hand. Go ahead.
So how do like bubbles work? Like how is it that like a stock price gets like such a high amount? Like I heard that it's like when the stock price is like detached from the company's actual value, but if stock prices are based on how much like how many people buy the stock and not on the company's value, then how does that work?
So there's a document I'm going to send out in notes that has a much longer explanation. I'll give you the very short story of bubbles right now. So economics and like financial markets are much more irrational than they pretend to be. So at the end of the day, financial markets are based on imperfect information. No one really knows whether a company is going to succeed or fail. We can make reasonable guesses and estimates, but no one really knows. But at the end of the day, most investments are bets. When you make an investment into a company, you're basically betting that that company is going to do well in the future. So the idea of a bubble is basically that in many instances, the price of an asset, in other words, a thing that you can buy, starts to go up and investors start to get really confident about that thing. And basic supply and demand, when a bunch of investors start to get really confident about something, they start to buy more and more and more and more and more of that thing. And what does that cause to price? The price goes up. And that further fuels the expectation that whatever the underlying thing is, houses, stocks, bonds, whatever it happens to be, people increasingly believe that thing is really, really going to be great. It's going to be the big thing or whatever. And that causes more and more demand, more and more asset purchases, and prices go up and up and up. So the idea of bubbles is that basically investors are often irrationally bullish, or in other words, like optimistic about a company, about a stock, about an asset. And that often causes a whole big market cycle to kind of invest heavily into something. At some point in time, the underlying cause of that investment stops. So maybe the company actually is shown to be insolvent, or maybe people realize that the expectations are overly rosy, and then a bunch of investors sell off. That's when the bubble, quote unquote, pops. To give a kind of clear example for this, if you look at the 2008 recession in the United States, what basically happened starting in kind of the late 1990s and early 2000s was a housing bubble. And what that basically meant was people were really, really optimistic about the prices of future houses. And so basically there was a huge, there were other reasons for this as well, like cheap access to credit. There were institutions like Fannie and Freddie Mac that were able to expand access to home ownership and mortgages and stuff. But long story short, a bunch of people started to buy up houses. Housing prices start going up. Wall Street gets in on it. Everyone thinks that housing prices are going to keep going on and on and on. It looks like a fantastic way to make money. People feel confident. People feel optimistic. So people buy houses. They buy mortgage-backed securities. There's a whole financialized sector that arises around mortgages, and eventually the bubble pops. And once mortgages, for example, start falling into delinquency and bankruptcy, once investors stop buying houses, housing prices crash. And once housing prices crash, the bubble bursts. And all of a sudden, your massively built up value collapses. So like the long story short answer to your question is that bubbles basically arise when there is irrational market confidence around something, and that something eventually betrays or belies that confidence. Does that kind of make sense in terms of like what that looks like or how that works? Yeah, it's literally gambling. Stock markets are de facto gambling halls. Like the New York Stock Exchange is arguably just the world's largest casino, but like average people are the people who are held like hostage when things go astray, if that kind of helps. Anyway,
What does like the value of the company have to do with like its stock price?
Yeah, so the idea is, we'll talk about this at the very end, but the value of all of your shares multiplied by their price is often used as a rough heuristic for how valuable the company is. So you'll hear people say things like Apple is worth $1 trillion. It basically just means that if you took all the shares of stock that are owned of Apple stock and multiplied it by the current share of Apple price, that would basically come out to roughly $1 trillion. The idea though of how valuable is a company, it basically means like how profitable do you think that company will be in the future? That's what dictates whether or not people buy a company share. If you think that the company is going to be valuable in the future, in other words, profitable in the future, you buy their stock because you know that the company is going to become profitable. More people will buy the stock, the price will go up. You can sell that stock price. You can sell the stock at a higher price than you bought it at and make money. If you don't think the company is going to be profitable, that's where the value of a company goes down, basically. Quickly on bonds, bonds are different than stocks in one really important way, which basically is just that bonds are basically just IOUs. In other words, most commonly a government will say something like, you will give us money, and then over a certain amount of time called a maturation period, we will pay you back your money with a little bit of interest tacked on top. These are called yields, basically. Like, what's the yield of a bond? How much extra is the bond going to pay back? And this is the most common way that governments raise money. It's basically when governments say, hey, you will pay us this amount of money, we'll pay you a certain amount of interest back on top of that. It's basically like a loan, but it kind of works in the inverse direction, where like a government asks for a loan and then tells you how much it's going to pay back, as opposed to you going to a bank and being like, yo, bank, I want a mortgage and I will only pay this amount for it, basically is the gist. I'm going to skip this slide because it's not uber duper super duper important. But like the kind of like main gist is that derivatives are a very kind of funky type of asset. The most common derivative assets are called futures, swaps, and options. Credit default swaps, they're a type of swap, were one of the largest kind of contributing factors to 2008 recession. Basically, the gist was that a bunch of companies placed huge bets on whether or not certain assets would fail. And when those assets failed, the counterparties to credit default swaps were liable for enormous amounts of money. And so when those mortgage-backed securities failed, those insurance companies got mega fucked. In theory, derivatives are not inherently bad. Like, you can speculate on whether, for example, you think inflation will go up in the future. The problem is that, especially prior to the 2008 recession, a bunch of derivatives were used to what's called speculate. When you speculate, you're basically more or less taking some sort of financial product and using it to basically gamble, to basically bet on the underlying value of something. So derivatives are based on some underlying asset. So for example, maybe we have a derivative contract that's basically like, you know, will the price of this thing go up in the future? And if it does, I make money. If it doesn't, you make money. The issue is that in theory, derivatives can be used to hedge against risk. So in other words, maybe I made an original investment that I'll gain money if something goes up in value, and I'll have a derivatives contract that says if that thing actually goes down in value, I'll make money. So either way, I'm insured. I've hedged against risk, and I have a potential bet that I'll make me money if it pays off. But increasingly in the modern era, derivatives are often used to speculate. Securitization is kind of a weird concept within finance. Basically, the gist is securitization is when you take really small individual sort of securities and bundle them together and sell the bundles off to investors. So the mortgage-backed security is a really common example of securitization. The gist of a mortgage-backed security, and I talk about this more in one of the videos I'm going to send out to you guys later about the 2008 recession, is individually, mortgage rates right now are like not super crazy high. Like, in other words, if I'm an investor and I give David a mortgage and then David pays me back the mortgage, I make like 4 or 5% interest. It's kind of like not enough to really justify anything. But if I bundle 3,000 people's mortgages together, that's where I start making money. So the idea of securitization is basically taking a bunch of different securities and pooling them together. Kind of interesting example of this is student loan asset-backed securities. They're called SLABs, SLABSs. And they're kind of increasing example of this. Financialization, I wrote this and didn't explain what it meant. Financialization is the increasing amount of economic power and financial clout that the financial sector has within the overall economy. Okay, I know I'm going to run over, but I actually want to ask you guys a question. Do you guys want to have a 3-minute Ryan rant about student loan debts? It's not a rant about student loan debts. It's just like vaguely related, but it's not super economics-y. But it will like push like the end of the presentation back by like a solid 3 minutes. Okay, cool. People are down for it. This is not entirely my rant. Large credit goes to Hank Green. This is a really interesting just thing that I think people should know about and makes for a fantastic argument if it ever comes up in debate. It never has for me, but I'm really excited for it to one day, maybe. Question, how much student debt roughly do you think there is in the United States? Someone just like unmute and shout out a rough answer.
$1.9 trillion.
It's about 1.75 trillion, roughly. So probably somewhere around right now, it's going to be nearing 2 trillion pretty soon. So you're basically right around somewhere in that ballpark. Think about that for a second. 1.75 trillion dollars of student loan debt, right? If someone had to guess roughly how much does that work out for the average student to have in terms of a debt burden? Like roughly, you don't have to do math, just like guess, someone guess. How much debt does the average?
100,000?
Fortunately not that crazy, but roughly somewhere in the ballpark of 39,000-ish, 40,000-ish. And you're right, to be clear, you're right that some people have like an obscene amount of debt. There are people that have $300,000 worth of debt. But the average student debt loan holder in the United States has somewhere around $39,000 worth of student debt. All right. Here's an interesting question, though. The average person has somewhere in the ballpark of $39,000 worth of student loan debt. Question for you, who's the most likely to default on their loans? Now, I'm not going to have you answer this because the question I'm asking is kind of weird. But this is a graph I want you to look at for a quick second. Does someone know what this graph is saying? Like, what does it mean? Less student debt, higher default rates. What does that mean if someone wants to guess?
Like the less debt that you're getting from student loans or whatever, the more likely you are to not to fail to pay them back.
Yeah. So this is counterintuitive to what most people think. So when you think of student loan debt, you would assume that this graph would work the opposite way, presumably. You would guess that the sort of person that has $100,000 of student loan debt is much more likely to be unable to pay back their debt than someone that has $1,000 of student loan debt. But interesting thing is that's not true. If you look at the rate of default, the less debt you have, the more likely you are to not pay back your loans. And this is weird, right? Because most people's intuition would say it should be the opposite. So the solution, of course, is not just to give people more debt, because that's not the actual problem at play here. The problem at play here is if you look at this group right here, there's something unique about them. This group that has a somewhat smaller amount of debt. Does anyone want to guess what's unique about the group of people that has somewhere between $1,000 and $10,000 of student loans? This is like a weird question, I know. Let's see who has raised their hand. Isha.
Well, the caption says they have less high-paying jobs, so you have less money to pay them back with.
You got it, for sure, absolutely. Less education, Varun, yeah.
Well, I kind of had more of a question about defaulting.
We'll get to that in a second. Actually, just ask it now. Why not?
Okay, I was gonna say, is defaulting, would it be considered defaulting if you're paying, is it only if you just stop paying your debt, or is it if you're what does unable to pay your debt look like?
Basically means that you just don't have the money to make your loan payments. So it's not like you deliberately stop paying them. It's like you just don't have the money to pay back your debts, basically. Other interesting thing about student loan debt, you can't cancel it by declaring bankruptcy. Almost every other type of debt, medical debt even, if you declare bankruptcy, you're no longer required to pay that. It doesn't work for student debt. So basically the question that people are, the answer that people are putting in chat is you have less education, and you're right. But it's a little bit trickier than that. The reason that this group of people is think about this, 34% likely to default, 1 in 3 people that has between $1,000 and $5,000 of debt is likely to default, is because the group that never gets talked about in the student loan debate, these groups of people often didn't graduate college. 40%, and this is a crazy statistic, 40% of all student loan debt in the United States is owned by people that never graduated college. 40%. It's a huge amount. It's a shocking amount, really. And it makes sense when you think about it. Because what Isha said is right. These people don't get high-paying jobs. Why don't they get high-paying jobs? It's because they, for whatever reason, weren't able to graduate college, right? So the basic gist is the most likely group of people to default on their loans are the people who, for whatever reason, academic reasons, emotional reasons, financial reasons, literally weren't able to graduate college, but they're still saddled with debt, because it's not like you only are forced to pay back your college loan debts if you finished college. So this is not like an argument that you can make in debate. It's just an interesting piece of context I think can be quite interesting. The fact that the people who are the most likely to default are the ones that have the least debt, but are also the least capable of paying back that debt because they're not the ones who are able to access the benefits of a college education. Anyways, Brian rant over. Okay, next thing we're going to chat about central banks. I love this man right here. His name is Jerome Powell. He's an absolute G. I say this I don't know whether I say this sarcastically, Everyone who's my friend knows that I'm obsessed with this man. I send so many memes about Jerome Powell. He's the current chairman of the Federal Reserve. I think he is so fun. Everyone say hi, Jerome. That's Jerome. Anyways, okay. Someone left after that. Fair. Okay. Central banks, what are they? What do they do? Central banks, they're very fun, very entertaining. They're very nice. Okay, what are central banks? They're not actually just banks located in the center of anything. That'd be funny if they were that. Central banks are the institutions that are responsible for managing monetary policy. Ryan, what is monetary policy? Great question, Ryan. So glad you asked. There are two types of economic policies in the world: fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is the things that governments do. It's things like raising taxes, raising spending, cutting taxes, cutting spending. So things like stimulus checks, that's fiscal policy. Things like the government commissioning a new highway, that's fiscal policy. Things like the government regulating the economy, that's also fiscal policy. But monetary policy is not something that Congress controls. It's not something that Parliament controls. Not something that Joe Biden or Justin Trudeau is going to be putting their messy, greedy political paws on. Monetary policy is controlled by institutions called the central bank, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, a bunch of different names for them in different countries. Basically, central banks don't control taxes. They don't control spending. What they do control is they control policy around money, interest rates, money supply, exchange rates, things like that. So we're going to talk about what central banks exactly do, but TLDR, central banks are non-partisan institutions that basically manage a country's currency and they manage a country's money supply. But unlike fiscal policy, they're not controlling things like taxes or spending. So what exactly do central banks do? There's three big things that central banks do. First is open market operations. This is basically when a central bank buys or sells government bonds. The main gist is that central banks will always act in one of two ways. They'll either act in an expansionary way, where they're trying to grow the economy, or central banks can act in a contractionary way, where they're trying to shrink the economy. You might ask yourself the question, why would a central bank ever want to shrink the economy? They're doing it right now, actually. The reason why is because sometimes economic growth gets out of hand. Prices go up too much, the economy is expanding too much, and you need to cool things off. So the first set of tools that central banks have at their disposal to do either of those things, expand or contract / shrink / restrict economic growth, is to engage in open market operations. When you buy government bonds, that basically means, in other words, that more or less you go to a bunch of banks in the economy and you say, hey man, would you want to buy any government bonds? And they're like, hey, and like whatever, like you go to banks and you're like, hey, I'll buy your government bonds from you. So in other words, I explained that poorly. I messed up my words. Here's what I mean. If Goldman Sachs right now owns a government bond they bought 20 years ago, the Federal Reserve, which is the US central bank, might go to them and be like, hey, we'll buy that bond from you. Guess what happens when the Fed buys the bond from Goldman Sachs? Goldman Sachs gets the cha-ching, cha-ching, money, money, money. And now Goldman Sachs has more money to play with, expands the economy, more lending, more money going through the economy. Or the Federal Reserve goes to Goldman Sachs and they sell bonds. So for example, the Federal Reserve goes to Goldman Sachs and says, hey man, you wanna buy some bonds from us? If Goldman Sachs says yes, guess what happens? Goldman Sachs takes its money and gives its money to the Federal Reserve, taking money out of the economy, contracting the money supply, and taking the economy down a notch. Second thing central banks can do is they can influence interest rates. Flag on the play, quick pause here. Central banks do not set interest rates. This is a misnomer. Central banks influence interest rates because they themselves set interest rates, which then acts as the benchmark for private sector interest rates. I have a longer document that I'll send out to you guys tomorrow explaining exactly how this works. But TLDR, remember those whole interest rates from before? Yeah, central banks get to influence those. If the central bank wants to expand the economy, they lower rates. That's what the Federal Reserve, for example, did in March of 2020. They slashed rates to basically 0.25% and then 0%. If you want to, as the Fed is doing right now, rein in economic growth, you raise interest rates because that makes borrowing more costly and takes money out of the economy. The third thing that central banks can do is they can change the reserve ratio. We chatted about this before, but this is basically the percentage of deposits that banks have to keep in reserve. The more money that you have in reserve, the less that you can lend out, and therefore the less economic activity that there is. That being said, central banks, especially around 2000-ish, started to realize that these three tools of conventionary monetary policy, which, just to be clear, open market operations, influencing interest rates, and changing the reserve ratio, are not perfect at affecting the financial sector. So this is where we're going to chat about the two unconventional central banking policies. one of which is way more important than the other. So we're going to start by chatting about the yield curve. And there's going to be a Kahoot question on this. So yay, pay attention. Yield curve, what does it mean? Does anyone want to take a guess at what this whole yield curve thing is representing? So, this is a really hard question. I apologize, but it's kind of funky. Or like what this curve is trying to say. I know it's a weird question. I know it's a funky question.
The longer you borrow money for, the higher the interest is.
Yeah, you got it. So fantastic, really good job. So basically, this is basically a graph, and I'm going to try to limit my use of graphs for tonight because I know these are funky, but this is basically a graph that more or less shows the relationship between how long a bond is issued for and the yield on that bond, how much that bond pays. Now, in general, the general relationship is that if I'm selling you a bond that's not going to be paid off for 30 years, so many things could happen in 30 years, man. Like the pterodactyls could come back for all I know. And so if I'm an investor and I'm going to buy a 30-year-long bond, I'm going to demand a freakishly high interest rate, like 3%. I know, crazy. Whoa, hang on. And basically what this means is that this yield curve basically represents the relationship between bond yields, in other words, interest rates, and the amount of time it takes for a bond to mature, in other words, finish being paid off over the course of time. Now, this sort of first maybe 5, 7, 8, maybe 10-year period of bonds, in other words, a bond that takes 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years to mature, the Federal Reserve, or a central bank in general, has pretty decent control over those interest rates. In other words, you can set interest rates, you can affect the money supply. So you have pretty direct control if you're Jerome Powell, if you're a central bank, over these interest rates. But these longer term yields, they're much harder to influence, but they're really important. And the reason they're really important is actually, ironically, as I was writing this presentation, I had to revise it because yesterday something really monumental happened, which is that sometimes you'll have what's called an inverted yield curve, which is where, weirdly enough, the long-term bonds start to offer lower yields than the short-term bonds. And if you pause and think about what that means is, in other words, a bond that will pay off in 6 months is going to pay more money than the bond that's going to pay off in 6 years. And that doesn't sound scary, it doesn't sound weird, but think about what that means. When interest rates are high, that basically means that investors think that you're risky, because they are so scared of you not being able to pay back your loan that they're going to compensate by demanding an extra high rate to hedge against that risk of you failing to pay off. They want extra money to compensate for the risk. If short-term bonds are offering a higher yield than long-term bonds, what does that say about what investors think about the economy? Anyone?
In the short term, it's more risky to invest than in the long term.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have what's called an inverted yield curve, that basically just means that investors think that the economy right now is in a really precarious position. This is one of the absolute best indicators for when a recession is coming. So that's not good. But for the purposes of yield curves, cool lesson. Anyways, this brings us to the actual thing we're going to chat about, which is quantitative easing, QE, my favorite economic concept. Love it. Fantastic. Amazing. I want a birthday cake with this brand on it because I think it would be so funny. Quantitative easing. That was mostly a joke, but also not. What is quantitative easing? This is, I'm so sorry, guys. I'm so sorry. This is the most technical slide in this entire presentation. Quantitative easing is basically when central banks buy up a fuck ton of assets held by banks that have relatively long maturation periods. In other words, you basically buy up a ton of things that banks own, and you basically put those onto the balance sheets of the central bank. Why do central banks do this? It's really simple, guys, because basically what you more or less do is when you engage in quantitative easing, what you basically are more or less doing is putting a bunch of money into banks with the goal of allowing banks to use that money and start to lend. Use that money to start to invest, use that money to start doing all the things that banks normally would be doing. This solves the problem, what's called a credit crunch, which basically is when banks are too scared to lend. They're worried that other banks are going to collapse. They're worried that people are going to lose their jobs. So they just stop giving money, which actually worsens recessions. So the idea of quantitative easing is that when central banks buy a bunch of the things that sort of banks normally have on their balance sheets, it puts a bunch of money into the financial sector, and as a consequence, sort of rejuvenates the whole financial sector. The question you might ask is, what's the difference between quantitative easing and central sort of like conventional market operations, like open market operations? The main gist is that quantitative easing happens at a much larger scale, and it generally tends to target longer term and often riskier assets. And I just want to quickly draw attention to this because this shocked me when I found this out. The amount of quantitative easing that the Federal Reserve, which is the US central bank, did during COVID is truly incredible. This graph is really hard to read, but this graph shows you the amount of money, basically, or the value of assets that the central bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, owns. Heading into the pandemic in March of 2020, it was around 4 trillion. Right now, it's around 9 trillion. So about $5 trillion of money was put into the banking sector by the Federal Reserve in just the past, and even just like, look at this, right? Between March of 2020 and basically June of 2020, basically, the Federal Reserve injected something like $3 trillion worth of US dollars into the economy. That's crazy, man. Anyways, oh, this is a funny, I started doing a petition earlier. Negative interest rates are the other unconventional policy that banks will sometimes engage in. I think that these are called NIRP, N-I-R-P, negative interest rate policy. I think NIRP should become a slang term because it sounds so cool, like NIRP. That's so NIRP of you, man, like N-I-R-P, negative, like it just sounds really cool. Anyways, I didn't actually set up a petition, don't worry, guys. But negative interest rates is basically when, like, if you want to stimulate the economy, you bring interest rates down, but eventually you hit 0% interest rates. And then you're like, bro, what the fuck do I do now? And some banks, like Japan did this a bunch, will like be like, well, maybe we go negative. It's really funky, and I'm not going to talk about it because it's really weird and confusing. So we're going to move on. All right, next thing we're going to chat about under finance is regulation. Then we're going to chat currency. Then we're going to chat recessions. Then we'll be done for the night. Well, then we have Kahoot, so woohoo. Regulation. I'm going to be fully honest, guys. Like, regulations in the financial sector are like hella complicated, weird, funky, chunky monkey ice cream. They're really weird. Like the Dodd-Frank Act, which is the main piece of legislation regulating banks in the United States, is like 848 pages long. I tried doing a thing where I just tried like copying pasting the entire table of contents from it into this presentation, and it would have taken up like 8 slides in the presentation. It's incredibly long. But there's a bunch of really weird, opaque regulations on the financial sector. There's 3 big ones that you should know about. FDIC, we talked about earlier, which basically tries to stop bank runs by insuring consumer deposits. The Dodd-Frank Act, which is formerly called the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, horrible acronym, basically was passed after the 2008 recession. The 3 big things that it does basically is more or less it created a bunch of institutions and regulatory agencies that try to stop kind of profiteering within Wall Street and try to protect consumers. It also secondarily bans what's called proprietary trading. TLDR, long story short, prop or proprietary trading is when investment banks take their own money and do their own investing with their own money. This sounds innocuous. It's horrible because they almost always invest in the riskiest fucking things on planet Earth. And there's also a bunch of regulations imposed on banks in general to invest in less risky assets and have more money on hand in times of recession. Some of these regulations were rolled back in 2017 under Trump, but the bulk of the Dodd-Frank Act remains intact. Glass-Steagall, okay, hang on. I'm just gonna say it, guys. I am so sad that the Glass-Steagall Act got repealed. It got repealed 4 years before I was born, but I still feel really sad about it. The Glass-Steagall Act was repealed in 1999. It basically was passed in 1933 originally under FDR. And what it basically said is, if you're a bank, you cannot do both commercial banking and investment banking. But Ryan, why is that a bad thing to do both? Great question. Because think about it, guys. If I'm a regular old person, I'm like Granny, and I like, or better yet, I'm Carl, right? Our favorite buddy, Carl. If Carl has money and puts it into a bank, why is Carl putting his money into the bank? Because he wants like stable returns. He wants his money to be safe. But if that bank can take Carl's money and do a bunch of really sketchy shenanigans with investing, like not just lending to like your local pizzeria, but like investing into fucking like student loan asset-backed mortgage security, like that's the risk. And the reason why the Glass-Steagall Act was created was to basically stop that from happening. There's a few regulatory agencies that are responsible for enforcing these types of laws. The SEC is the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's largely responsible for most of these regulations. The Federal Reserve also has a degree of regulatory influence, so it conducts things that are called stress tests. Basically, the best way of thinking about stress tests is it would be like going up to a boxer, excuse me, punching them really hard in the gut and seeing how well they take it and being like, oh, if you take the punch really well, you must be good at boxing. That's basically stress tests, except it's where the Federal Reserve goes to banks and like does like financial simulations that are like, well, hypothetically, if our entire economy collapsed, would you collapse too? Haha, JK. But if you don't pass this test, we're going to break you up. Yeah, Varun.
I mean, if the like the Glass Act or whatever it's called,
Glass-Steagall, don't
the
disrespect
Glass,
me.
the Stiegel Act, Ryan. If it was like that characterly important for you to like have banks be separated, why did it ultimately get removed?
Good question. Ironically, it was removed under a Democratic administration, Bill Clinton in '99. The main reason why is because the main criticism of the bill was basically that it was bad to limit banking diversification. Like, in other words, it's bad to stop banks from doing both investment and commercial banking. The real reason it was repealed is because it was toothless. By 1999, basically, Glass-Steagall was de facto not even enforceable. So, for example, Travelers and Citicorp, which were the world's largest investment bank and insurance company at that point in time, merged in 1999. Alan Greenspan was the chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1999, so he had influence over whether or not to invoke the Glass-Steagall Act and stop that merger from happening. He basically delegated all control over mergers and their interaction with the Glass-Steagall Act to the New York Reserve Bank, which like the Federal Reserve has 12 chapter banks or 12 regional banks. He delegated almost all Glass-Steagall enforcement authority to the New York Bank. Do you guys know it's located in New York? That's right, Wall Street. Do you want to know almost all of the directors on the New York Regional Federal Reserve Bank, who they are? Yeah, they're all former Wall Street people. And so basically they approved the merger, at which point the Glass-Steagall Act was basically officially dead. So Clinton was like, well, fuck it, we're just going to kick this one out. And so they kicked it out, which was really sad. Okay, I really want to chat about shadow banking, but we probably don't have time to really chat about shadow banking, so I'll do a 30-second version of this. What is shadow banking? Shadow banking is basically just banking that doesn't accept deposits and therefore is able to skirt around a bunch of regulations. This is a really funny quote from the IMF. If it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and acts like a duck, it's a duck, or so the saying goes. But what about an institution that looks like a bank and acts like a bank? Actually, it's often a shadow bank. Shadow banking is basically the thing that arises where basically you have a bunch of really risky investing that isn't regulated or can't be regulated because these institutions don't accept deposits, and therefore they're not subject to conventional regulations, including FDIC insurance. Hedge funds, investment banks, money mutual market funds are all examples of that. This is a weird example. Google regulation Q if you want to figure out what this thing means. Housing, there's a document I'm going to send out for you to understand housing. Same thing for asset bubbles, although we talked about asset bubbles earlier, so we're experts on that. Okay, last thing under finance, then we'll chat about recessions and then be done for the night. Currency. This is the most technical part of this presentation. I'll warn you in advance. It's probably the funkiest. Also, can you just all take a moment to appreciate this slide? This took so much Photoshop effort, and it was like the fault on our currency swaps. You can swap currencies. The Federal Reserve does these swap line things with other banks. There's 6 central banks outside the United States that have swap lines established with the Fed. So much fun. Currency. Thank you. What is currency? Currency is basically just a thing that you use to buy stuff. And the reason currency is important is because if we didn't have currency, we'd have to barter for things. So I would come to you and I'd be like, hey, I can give you an econ presentation for debate and you can give me food. And unfortunately, that's not a very valuable commodity. So I would starve, and that would be sad. So currency more broadly serves 3 purposes. It acts as a medium of exchange. This is the thing that most people are the most familiar with, which basically just means that currency is used to exchange things. Like I have a dollar bill and I can buy food with it. Just kidding, it doesn't cost $1 anymore. But currency also serves 2 other purposes. It serves the purpose of being a unit of account. So for example, we can compare 2 different things and we can have a common metric for comparing their value. So for example, we can all agree that this phone is probably more valuable than this pen. I'm not sure if you can see my camera because I have it switched off, I guess. But anyways, the gist though, basically though, more or less, is just like, kind of TLDR, more or less like, currency allows us to compare different values. Like this thing is $5, that thing is $500. Currency also acts as a store of value, which basically means that it has value now and in the future. That's not true for commodity goods. So for example, oil might be really valuable right now, but probably won't be in 100 years. Exchange rates, what are they? How do they work? The gist is different countries and different economies use different currencies. The US uses the dollar. The European Union partially uses the euro. South Africa uses the rand. And interestingly, currencies can be used to buy other currencies. This is something that you don't really experience unless you're an American going to a Canadian debate competition, in which case you have to exchange your American dollars for Canadian dollars because you can't use American dollars in Canada. But basically the gist more or less is that different currencies have different levels of purchasing power. Some currencies buy you a lot of stuff, some currencies buy you very little. So for example, $1 has the same purchasing power as roughly 130 Japanese yen, which basically means that I can buy the same amount of stuff with $1 as I can buy with 130 Japanese currency, which is kind of a big difference. In this instance, therefore, the relative purchasing power of the US dollar is way larger compared to that of the Japanese yen. Quick random side note, this is so unimportant. The reason Japan's currency is super weak is because the Japanese central bank is absolutely a huge simp for quantitative easing and does an insane amount of quantitative easing to keep the value of their currency incredibly low. Very odd. Anyways, now the main gist is just that the thing I want to like pound into your heads is that whenever you talk about currency in debate, you're almost always talking about the value of one currency relative to that of another currency. And I'll explain why this is relevant for debate in a second. But in order to make this make sense, I'm going to walk through a bit of an example of explaining like why different currencies matter. So in order to explain this, Carl wants to get a French fry, and French fries are only made in France, but Carl is in America, okay? So here's the situation, all right? I'll narrate it. Carl wants to buy French fries from France, and he has some American dollars. So what he does is he goes to France, or rather he sends money to France, and he says, hey, here's your dollar bill. And then the French dude is like, bruh, that is so not fair, because guess what? Do you think that, guys, look at this French dude. Look at that mustache. Look at that wine. Look at those baguettes. Do you think that this man is going to accept a US fucking dollar for his beautiful, gorgeous, crispy, golden brown French fries? No, he won't. So the problem is that now Carl is all sad because he wanted to buy French fries, but his American dollars don't get him French fries. So here's what he does. He goes to a bank. He says, hey, man, I need to get some European money. And so what he does is he exchanges his dollars to the bank for some European euros. Then he sends his European euros over to France. And then in exchange, he gets his French fries. And then all of a sudden, woohoo, yay, hurrah. Everyone give a big round of applause. Woo, yeah, go Carl, because Carl got his French fries. Yay, happy Carl. So the takeaway is just that whenever you have international transactions, you always have to transact currency, which means, interestingly, currencies themselves are goods. You use currencies to get other currencies. And this means that currencies are subject to the same laws of supply and demand as any other commodity, any other good is. Varun, is that a question?
Yeah, like I guess like under this logic, like what does it mean to be like backed by the US dollar?
We'll talk about that in a second when we talk about dollarization. The second takeaway really quickly is that whenever you have increased demand for something that's made in a country, there's also increased demand for that country's currency. If more people want to buy shit made in the United States, there's also more demand for the US dollar. If there's, for example, higher interest rates in the European Union, that means more people want to invest into the European Union to capitalize on those higher interest rates, which also means there's higher demand for the European euro, which therefore means that the value of the European euro goes up. And this is called appreciation or depreciation. So when your currency becomes more valuable, either because there's less supply or increased demand, your currency appreciates. And when there is less demand or increased supply of your currency, that causes depreciation. What do these things mean? When your currency appreciates, its value goes up. That means that it is cheaper to buy things made elsewhere and more expensive to sell your stuff elsewhere. Why? I want you to think about this for a quick second, guys, right? If your currency grows stronger, that means that your currency can buy more stuff elsewhere. But it means that other countries need to have more money to buy the same amount of your currency, which is what they need to get to buy your stuff. So when your currency appreciates, it's cheaper to buy stuff that's made elsewhere, but harder to sell your own things elsewhere. On the flip side, when you have a weaker currency because your currency depreciated, it is more expensive to import, but it's much easier to export. In other words, other countries have comparatively stronger currencies, which means that they're more able to buy your currency and therefore buy your goods, but the flip side is not true. So just to be clear on what this means, when there is an increased demand for your currency appreciates, that makes it cheaper to import, costlier to export. The flip side is the opposite. Decreased demand equals depreciation that makes it costlier to import and cheaper to export. To be clear though, the rules of supply and demand are supreme. If there is more demand for your currency appreciates. If there is less demand for your currency depreciates. And the subsequent impact of that is basically that. There's 5 implications of this into debate I'm going to identify. The first is just a cool impact of inflation. There's this concept in economics called original sin. And what this basically means is that in the vast majority of instances, there's only a few currencies that sovereign debt will ever be denominated in. And what that basically just means is that in the vast bulk of instances, when countries want to borrow, in other words, take on debt, they almost always have to issue bonds or issue debt in a currency that isn't their own. So if I'm South Africa, I can't, in most instances at least, borrow in the South African rand. I have to first borrow in the US dollar and then convert my dollars for South African rands, basically. Why? Basically, larger dominant currencies like the dollar are relatively hegemonic. And that means that they benefit from things like network effects, so everyone uses them. And it's also the case that investors are more inclined to trust a currency like the euro, like the Chinese renminbi, like the US dollar, like the Japanese yen, because they're very stable, whereas the currencies of especially poor countries are often a lot more volatile. The really, really big takeaway from this, that was a really technical slide, is just that whenever the US dollar appreciates, it's really bad for poor countries, in at least lots of instances, because what it ends up meaning basically is that those poor countries have debts that are denominated, in other words, held in US dollars. It's now harder for poor countries to access or to basically buy US dollars, and therefore it's harder for them to pay off their debts. If anyone's been following the ongoing financial crisis in Sri Lanka, this is kind of what's happening in Sri Lanka. They've basically run out of foreign exchange reserves, which basically means they don't have enough foreign currency to pay back their debts. They're facing a massive debt crisis. The second implication of this whole currency stuff in debates is exchange rate regimes. I'm not going to cover this because it doesn't come up. Feel free to read the slides afterwards if you want. Third thing, and this is the much more common argument. I love making this argument in debate. It's so much fun. Dutch disease. What is the Dutch disease? Basically, the Dutch disease is a phenomenon within kind of macroeconomic development, which basically is that when your country suddenly, out of the blue, all of a sudden, starts getting a lot more demand for your shit, it causes your country's currency to appreciate, to go up in value. And this sounds good, but really interestingly, it actually is bad. Because when you, for example, have one really strong industries, when you have one industry that's really strong and really good at exporting, your currency appreciates. But interestingly, remember what we said earlier. When your currency appreciates, what happens to your exports? Come on, it's on the slide. It's on the slide, guys.
They get more costly.
Yeah, exactly. So when your currency appreciates, all of your other exports become more expensive. So what that basically means is that all of your other exports, just like out of the blue, become less competitive. So basically, if you get one really strong industry like natural resources, interestingly, you almost always end up getting a very heavily non-diversified economy because the strength of that one sector often makes other sectors of your economy far less diverse. Fourth implication, currency unions. Should we talk about this? We'll talk about it really quickly. Currency unions basically occur when multiple different countries trade with each other, but also share the same currency. No one thinks about it this way, but the United States is a currency union when you think about it. All 50 states share the same currency. We all use the same currency. To get to your question, Varun, lots of countries in the world, I think it's 67, I want to say, either use the US dollar or have what's called a currency peg, which is this thing. A currency peg, quick embarrassing side story. When I first was learning about currency pegs, I Googled pegs and didn't know that there was a different meaning for peg and thought that it was a strictly financial term. Currency pegs basically occur more or less when you like more or less make the value of your currency fixed to the value of another currency. So for example, the Saudi Arabian currency is perpetually pegged to be one Saudi Arabia currency equals 3 US dollar currency. And that basically is the most common example of dollarization. Either is where you basically use the US dollar yourself. So Zimbabwe in the midst of its really bad hyperinflation crisis, for example, just abandoned their currency full scale and went to the dollar. Or you can actually just peg the value of your currency outright to the value of the US dollar. Currency unions, though, is like a more intense version of that. It's when multiple different countries use the same exact currency. European Union is a great example of that. 27 countries in the EU, 19 of them are on the euro. So they're different currencies altogether and they function differently. Oh, yes. Fantastic question in chat. Can dollarization be inaccurate? Yes. These are called currency black markets. One of my favorite debate arguments. So Venezuela, for example, has this whole thing with their exchange rate where the government is like, guys, this is how much our currency is worth. And everyone on the ground is like, no, that's not true. The currency is useless. It's valueless. But the government keeps being like, no, guys, we're really valuable. So sometimes countries can say that our currency equals this amount of another currency, but it's totally a lie, in which case you get currency black markets. Boo-hoo. So that's currency unions for you, though. They basically are multiple countries using the same currency. So that's kind of fun. Yeah, exactly. NFTs. Oh, fuck NFTs. I hate you, NFTs. What's a funny acronym for NFTs I can use to say how much I hate NFTs? No, never.
Not fucking tradable.
Never what?
Couldn't you just call them not fucking tradable because no one wants them anymore?
Oh, that's funny. That's good. Well, I thought I'm going to be adopting that. Yeah. I hate the fact there are actual museums to focus on that. I'm going to skip the random shit about currency. Although if anyone wants to have extended Zoom calls with me talking about currency speculation, I'd love to do it. It's so much fun. Hot money is a fantastic argument to make in debate, but it never comes up and it's too complicated. Okay. Really quickly, we're going to blitz through recessions, then be finished for the night, folks. Apologies, I'm running so late. In case you didn't notice, there's a lot we were trying to cover. So very sad, very tragic, very tragic. All right. Recessions, really quick. Oh, this is just me rhyming recessions. You can read that afterwards. Recessions is basically just when the economy is struggling. Main gist of the kind of like main kind of big picture gist of recessions, more or less, is that the kind of like big idea behind recessions is just that the economy is struggling. Keynesian economic theory was developed during the 1930s, and basically it was a theory that says the best thing that we can do in times of economic crisis is to increase demand. And the best way to do that is for the government to spend a bunch of money, even if it's totally non-productive. Like we should just like pay people to dig holes in the ground and then pay someone else to fill in the holes. Like that's how intense we're talking. So Keynesian economics says the solution to economic crisis is to spend money and for the government to spend money. And that's how we're going to get out of economic crisis. In practice, what this means in debate is that you can basically make arguments about increasing aggregate demand. In other words, consumer spending, like private sector investment or government spending is the best way to get out of economic crisis. Interestingly, kind of as a weird example of this can sometimes not necessarily always be an objectively good thing in the world. So for example, this is a graph showing US government spending between basically in the past century. Anyone know what was happening between 1941 and 1945, roughly?
Big war.
World War II.
World War II. And the United States spent a shit ton of money on their defense department, like a bunch of money on their defense department, right? Interesting thing about that. Anyone see a relationship?
There's low unemployment.
Yeah. So
The draft.
interestingly, when the government goes to war, it's almost always great for GDP. I know it's weird to say, and I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying it's a thing. So this is led to what's called the broken windows fallacy, which basically is an argument that like the fact that something is good for the economy doesn't necessarily mean it's good for the world. Like right now, Russia's economy counterintuitively is in part benefited from the war effort because it gets to spend a fuck ton of money on like soldier contracts and stuff. So unemployment goes artificially low, but it's still probably a bad thing. Then the 1970s happened, and basically more or less what happened is there was a lot of doubt that was cast on this whole Keynesian economics thing. Here's why. This is the last graph we're going to use today, I promise. But this graph basically shows you the relationship between price, supply, and demand. What this shows you basically is that if people were willing to buy something at a higher price, consumers are less willing to buy it, and suppliers are more willing to make it, right? Now, Keynesian economic theory basically says that in times of recession, what's happened is that there's not enough demand. And so what we need to do to fix the economy is to increase demand by increasing spending. The problem is that sometimes recessions look a little bit different. They look a little bit like this, where instead of demand being too low, supply is too low. And the problem with Keynesian economic theory is that it tries to focus on demand. So the goal of Keynesian economics is to increase spending to increase demand. But in periods where supply is the problem, the issue is not demand and too little demand. The issue is supply. And therefore, in periods of time, arguably like right now, where the economy is suffering because there's too little supply as opposed to too little demand, you can increase demand all you want. The only thing that you end up accomplishing, basically, is higher prices, which is a bad thing. So this resulted in basically the 1980s shift towards Reaganomics, which basically has been informally called trickle-down economics. And basically what it more or less means is that in periods of stagflation, where there is both inflation and recession at the same time, Keynesian economic crisis theory doesn't work. You can spend as much money as you want, but it doesn't fix the underlying problem. And that leads to kind of two very broad criticisms of Keynesian economic theory. The first is called Ricardian equivalence. The second is called crowding out effect. Feel free to read about them on your own time, but for the second time, I'm going to skip past them right now. Again, the slides will be emailed out to you afterwards. To conclude this presentation, though, and then we'll move to the coup, I do promise. How do you make arguments about recessions in debate? 3 questions you can ask yourself. First, how does an economic or even non-economic motion affect or apply in times of recession? Just generally, what happens in times of recession? Second, how does a policy affect the probability or the likelihood, in other words, of recession? How likely is it that some form of recession actually ends up happening? And lastly, how does a policy affect the longevity and the severity of recession? Like, for example, how long does a recession last? How intensely does it affect? Stuff like that. Anyways. Last thing, and this is actually the last slide, like the next slide is actually Kahoot time. Basically, the last thing I'll chat about is, I think, a fantastic argument that you can make in almost any argument about any debate about bailouts. Bailouts is basically when a firm is failing and the government steps in and basically gives them money to stop them from failing. This can often contribute to a problem called moral hazard. Risky investing strategies are called risky for a reason. There's a pretty good chance they fail, but if they don't fail, they pay off really highly. When banks expect to be bailed out in the event that those investments fail, there is counterintuitively a really bad thing that happens, which is that banks become in the future more likely to take on huge amounts of risk, while at the same time knowing that the potential benefits are huge and the costs are de facto tacitly insured by the government, since they think that they're too big to fail. If that firm fails, the government's going to step in, bail them out, and support them. So oftentimes you can make really good arguments in debate rounds about how we can limit moral hazard by sufficiently penalizing companies that engage in excessive risk-taking behavior. So, moral hazard. Yay, fun, exciting. Okay, enough of that stuff. Before we do Kahoot, questions on any of that, folks, or anything that's like confusing about that in general? I'm sure there's got to be something. We just covered like hard finance for like a long period of time.
So government bailouts, how is that like different than government subsidiaries?
Bailouts occur specifically when a company is failing. Subsidies occur generically to a company like in good times or bad times in general. It's not necessarily just exclusive to times when a company is struggling / failing.